Okay, so thank you very much for inviting me. So I guess I was asked to give a couple of lectures on topics related to trade and development. It's obviously a big topic which doesn't have a central organizing structure or thesis so much. And so while obviously there are ways to construct such a organizing structure or a thesis, I thought that was going to be a little bit tortured. So instead, what I'm going to do is talk about two kind of subject areas where there's interesting work in the kind of trade and development literature, interesting work that I've been involved in, which would maybe be more interesting to all of you. And I'll kind of review more generally the literature around those topics. And I wanted to start, I guess, with trying to think about measurement, and in particular, how we might measure the gains from trade, both across countries and potentially within countries across the income distribution. That's obviously a kind of classic literature in trade, and I won't be saying very much about kind of more aggregate methods, and instead I'll be focusing on really these distributional questions that I think Eric also touched on and Elhanan yesterday. Okay, so why are we interested in the question? How large are the gains from trade? How should these be shared across distribution? I think for an audience interested in international trade, that is a pretty obviously a central question. I think it's particularly central for developing countries when they're making decisions about how open they should be. And in order to make those decisions, it's useful to know the answers to these questions. And so that's what we'll be trying to think about, and in particular, think about these distributional effects, which are obviously central to the political economy of these questions when these countries actually go and implement these reforms, as well as trying to think about what type of additional policies you might want to put in place during a trade liberalization in order to ensure that those gains are kind of shared more broadly. Okay, so very broadly speaking, in the trade literature, we kind of have two approaches to this question. The first, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, is a very much reduced form approach, where essentially on the left-hand side we have something like growth, and on the right-hand side we have something that's trying to pick up how much you trade, how integrated with the world trading system you are, and we're going to project growth rates on openness. And typically the issue there is there's obviously reverse causation. As you grow more, you might start trading more, and so we need some sort of instrument. And the literature here has kind of relied on geographic instruments or geography, time-varying geography allowing panel regressions. I guess the starting point here is the kind of classic Frankel and Romer paper, and Jim Firer's more recent work exploiting the fact that places became differentially close and far apart with the invention of air travel, for example, which allowed air freight to move much more quickly, etc. Okay, so that's kind of one approach there. There's nothing here on distributional effects, although in principle you could do something on that. The second approach is kind of more structural, maybe more common in the trade literature. You write down a fully specified trade model, and from that fully specified trade model, you estimate the relevant parameters. Exactly how you do that will depend, and then you can then calculate any counterfactuals you like, such as what are the gains from trade, what are the distributional effects of those. So, obviously there's kind of pros and cons of these two different approaches. Much of the trade literature fits in here. Today I'm going to talk about a third approach, which kind of lies between these two extremes, and that involves adding some minimal structure and applying kind of first order approximations, and those will kind of line up particularly well with kind of causal estimates from modern applied micro approaches, and allow us to essentially answer some of these questions with at least the model not doing so much, and those causal estimates really shining. And this is going to be a particularly valuable approach, and I'd say increasingly valuable, given the incredibly rich data that is starting to become available and already is. And I'll give you kind of some highlights of that in the papers today. And what that's going to allow is because this approach kind of naturally starts with a kind of an individual and asks what, say, the welfare impacts for that individual are, then this is going to very naturally allow us to produce very, very nuanced and rich distributional effects using all this richness that comes out of the data. Okay, so let me kind of jump right in. I'm going to talk about a number of papers, and apologies to some of my students who've seen some of this before. I'll start out, I guess, the kind of originator of this implementation, at least this a way of estimating causal effects, is very much Angus Deaton. And then we'll kind of add more structure, particularly relevant for trade applications in the kind of middle of the lecture. And then we'll talk about some work I've done, as well as some recent work by Treb Allen and co-authors, which thinks about further extending this approach by going beyond the first order and thinking about variety of effects. Okay, so are there any questions at this point? I'm very happy to take questions at any point, obviously. In fact, I encourage them. Okay, so let me dive in. Okay, so the kind of context here is Deaton was interested in knowing what's the potential impact of a tax on exports of rice in Thailand. Thailand had a tax on exports, and they were thinking of removing it, and they wanted to know the impacts of this. And so, what was their goal here was to potentially reduce, or their goal was to reduce exports. They put this tax in place, in particular with the aim of lowering the prices of rice. There were domestic political economy reasons why that was worthwhile. So from an economic perspective, we can ask, was this sensible or not? And that's going to depend on a number of things. From our kind of standard trade toolkit, an export tax is equivalent to an import tariff. We know that there's potentially reasons you might want to do that. In particular, if you are indeed able to kind of lower the price that you're paying internationally, lower the price that you're receiving internationally through restricting quantities, and that will be typically worthwhile in small quantities. And so that's kind of one motivation here. We're not going to be able to say very much about that when looking at individuals. But the kind of second kind of big set of questions are distributional ones for Thailand. And in particular, before implementing this, they were very interested in understanding what impacts it was likely to have across the income distribution. So, we already know some of these things, or it's very likely that it's going to be the case that if you, get rid of this export tax, then that's going to kind of raise the price of rice. And we know that's not going to be very popular in the urban areas where they're kind of rice consumers. We also can kind of read off the data that the urban areas tend to be wealthier. And so if you care about distributional effects, the people who are going to be more harmed are going to be richer people, potentially poorer people within those urban areas, potentially wage labor, etc. We're not going to focus on that. We're going to focus on the rural areas where we're going to have richer data. And the rural areas is going to be much more nuanced because, of course, we have people who produce rice and people who consume rice. So Deaton just writes down very simply the welfare impacts of a price change, thinking about kind of small changes in prices, and then we can use our classic consumer theory in order to actually get quite far in answering this question. And we'll be kind of extending this kind of basic approach for the rest of the lecture today. Okay, so we'll start with a social welfare function. Welfare is a function of the utility of each of the individuals in society. Those are U1 to UH. And then each of those individuals is going to have their own utility function. I'll write it down as an indirect utility function that's going to depend on their total nominal income here and the price vector P. That nominal income, Deaton's going to break up into some exogenous component M. Think of this as maybe some government transfers, or if you're thinking of calculating equivalent or compensating variation, that's where you're going to see how much that's going to have to change in order to make these groups just as well off. And then there's this pi, which is going to be the profits from your household businesses. In particular, these are going to be farmers, and so that's mostly farmers. So that's going to be closely related to your farm profits. Okay, so just taking the kind of partial derivative, small change in prices, how does welfare change? Well, that's going to be the sum of the change in welfare of each of these individuals multiplied by the change in that social welfare function with the utility of one individual. So this is telling us something about how much society values each individual, and this is how much each individual's utility is changing with this price change. And we can then break out the change in utility with the price change for an individual into something which is essentially the social marginal utility of money, how much the social planner values an additional dollar going to you, multiplied by the change in household profits with respect to a small price change. This is how your income's changing, given that the M is exogenous, and then how your consumption's changing is going to depend on how the prices affect your indirect utility function directly. Okay, so this is all very, very straightforward. And then we can go and apply Hotelling's lemma and Roy's identity to already essentially make a lot of progress here. What's Hotelling's lemma? Well, the change in profits is with respect to a small change in prices is simply the quantity produced of the good. That's going to be yi. And Roy's identity says the derivative of this indirect utility function with respect to prices is going to be this social marginal utility of money times the quantity that you're consuming. So just collecting terms, we can see that the change in welfare with respect to a change in prices is going to equal how much society values this individual, this social marginal utility of money. That's where we expect poor individuals to have a higher social marginal utility of money under kind of standard assumptions on what a social welfare function might, or under, sorry, standard assumptions on the utility function. And then this term here, which is key, which is essentially whether you're a net producer or a net consumer. And if you're a net producer, then essentially you're going to be harmed by a price drop. Taking away this tax, you're going to benefit from a price rise because you're producing more than you're consuming. Okay, so we can write this in terms of derivatives with respect to log prices. It's going to be easier to deal with empirically. And then we've got the same expression, except for now, this is the share of your income coming from rice consumption. And this is now the share of your total consumption coming from rice consumption. This is the share of income coming from rice production. Okay, so there's a lot of assumptions bundled in here. Am I allowed to ask you to tell me what those assumptions are? Is that allowed in this forum, or are we meant to pile on? Identical individuals. Well, they have the same. They don't need to be identical in the sense that I haven't really said very much about their utility functions, and they should still, to the first order, obey these criteria. So they could have different preferences, for example, and essentially the budget share is capturing the kind of crucial information we're going to need in order to know to the first order how those guys, or with small price changes, how those guys are affected. And this is kind of dripping with strong assumptions. So any other thoughts? So one very, very strong assumption is there's no wage changes here. So all of your income's coming from your farm profits. That's something which, from a trade economist, given Stolper Samuelson and our kind of priors that trade affects wages. That's something which is going to be important. I think Deaton's argument is, this is rural Thailand, and primarily these are farm communities, and so I don't need to kind of go into those complications, but we'll talk about those in other trade contexts very shortly. There's also kind of no leisure here, and you may think people are substituting labor and leisure. We're assuming separability in the fact that we can kind of find the profit maximizing. Individuals are using their farm household, their farm is a company, and they're profit maximizing. That's why we're able to apply Hoteling's lemma, for example. So there's a bunch of assumptions caked in here, and probably the strongest of all is that these are small changes, and that's what's allowing us to ignore substitution effects, which may be quite important, and obviously we spend a lot of time thinking about. And one kind of extreme substitution effect that we'll talk about later is the arrival of new products, for example, which we think trade can affect, where if you kind of ignore substitution, then you're going to miss those types of effects. Okay, and obviously we can ignore substitution because of the envelope theorem for these small changes, but that would be starting to be egregious if we thought this was a massive trade. Okay, any questions? Okay, so what does he do? I'm not going to go into a lot of detail in this paper because I'll be discussing a bunch, but essentially what's kind of nice about these formulas is essentially I can read off this kind of production share going to rice from kind of household surveys or labor force surveys or agricultural surveys for this element here potentially. And I can read off my consumption share on rice from household surveys that construct consumption modules. So these are directly observable. These things are not really directly observable, right? We don't know how much society values each individual's utility or the social marginal utility of money. And Deaton's approach here is, these are things which maybe I should just leave to the policymaker or the politician. I'll provide you all of these things, and then the government can decide what to do with it. And so that's exactly what we're going to do. We're just going to kind of calculate for all the different individuals in rural Thailand how these kind of ratios or these differences between your production share and your consumption share vary with log income or log household income. And we think this is kind of a crude proxy for what we might have in mind for this social marginal utility of money. And then we can do this separately for rural households, for urban households, for different groups in society if we wanted to. And then the government could, how much do they weigh this particular minority group? If we weigh them more, then we care more that they're losing out, for example. Okay, so what do we find in this particular setting? And so this is a case where, just going through this logic really illustrates a lot of the richness of the potential impacts of getting rid of this export tax. So if we look at the poorest households who are this side, about 80% of them produce rice. Okay, so a huge share of poor households are growing rice. So we think that means that they're probably going to benefit from a price rise, except for the fact that only about 50% of them are selling rice. Okay, so if you're selling rice, absolutely want to buy a different variety of rice or something like that, which we don't think is important here, then these guys must be kind of net sellers if they're selling rice. And so already you can see that about half the poor people are likely to be winners from the rise in the price. And this group here is going to be a loser, but maybe not that big a loser because they are growing some and not that much. Meanwhile, these guys up here are really going to lose out. These guys are just consuming rice and they're not producing any. Price rise goes up, the price of rice goes up, these guys are going to suffer. Then if we go all the way over here to the richest households, the first thing is very few of them grow rice. Okay, so already that's telling us that those guys are mainly going to lose. But conditional on me growing rice, almost all of them are selling it, right? You have, if you do grow rice, you're rich, you have a big farm, you're a net producer. Okay, so this is already telling us a huge amount of information. We can go plot separately this proportion producing and proportion consuming. Deaton's going to get a bit fancier and do this with a kind of a contour plot. So this is like a mountain, and this is the top of the mountain up here. And this is the expenditure ratio. So I flipped it, budget share minus production share. And so all of these guys are losers up here. And actually, so you can see the kind of top of the mountain is actually losing. So the average person loses out from the prices going up because they're net consumers. But the mountain extends a long way into this negative territory where these guys are gaining because these are net producers. And it's not that the poorest are gaining the most or the richest. In fact, it's this group in the middle where there's a bunch of these kind of mid-sized farmers who are big net producers. And this is kind of a major occupation for these guys. It's these guys here who, almost all of them are producers because they're in bigger farms. And it's a large share of their total income. Okay, so you can see how we can get kind of very rich distributional impacts here, just thinking about the impact of getting rid of this export tax. Porto kind of took this idea, and this is, I think, one of the more underappreciated papers in trade in the last couple of decades. Took this idea and kind of put it into, not just thinking about the export tax changing one price, but trying to stick it into a more complete trade framework, particularly thinking about those wage effects, which really are central in our Heckscher-Ohlin models, etc. And so he's going to be looking at a particular context, which is Mercosur. Argentina joins Mercosur in 1992, and liberalization occurred by 95. And this was an agreement between Argentina, Brazil, Paraguay, and Uruguay. And their agreement was that they were going to have a kind of close to zero tariff among member states and a common external tariff, much like the European Union. And what this meant was actually quite dramatic changes in tariffs in different directions for different countries, depending on whether, compared to the rest of the bloc, they initially had a high or a low tariff as these kind of tariff rates were equalized. So to see this is kind of the 92 tariff for Argentina, and they had quite a low tariff on food and beverages and high tariffs on clothing, house equipment, and other traded goods. Meanwhile, under the trade agreement, the intrazone tariff was close to zero for all of these, a bit higher on clothing, that was obviously more sensitive. And the common external tariff was also relatively high, 13%, 18%, 14%, 11%. So what this means is actually, if you look at food and beverages, this was a rise in tariffs. If you look at the other products, this was a fall in tariff. Why? Well, because some of the stuff comes from Mercosur. That's in all cases a fall in tariffs. But anything coming from abroad in food, the tariff actually went up. Okay, so if you're importing your olive oil into Argentina, that becomes more expensive with Mercosur. Okay, so we get price increases for food and beverages, price falls for the other three. Okay, so what Porto is going to do is he's going to take that previous framework. Yeah.
So when you calculate price change, are you weighting this by?
Yeah, I think it's weighted by the initial import shares. Yeah. And so, yeah, this is capturing the fact that Argentina has a certain share of imports coming from outside zone and a certain share inside zone. Okay, so what were the strongest assumptions? Well, this wage assumption is particularly egregious for a trade economist. And we can extend this kind of very simply in that notation above. Now we're no longer going to just think about a direct price change. In kind of Deaton's approach, he was saying, listen, I'm going to think about an export tax that's being removed. That's going to raise the domestic prices. Let me think about who's affected by that rise in domestic prices. Now what we're going to ask is, we have some tariff changes. That's kind of data. We have these numbers I just showed you. We're going to have these 4 industries, 4 traded industries. And what we can do is, instead of looking at the change in welfare with change in prices, we can look at change in welfare with respect to a change in the tariff of one particular good. So we just stick outside this change in the price with respect to the change in the tariff, and we continue as before. This is what we had before. These are kind of household profit effects. These are the consumption effects. Now we're just going to add an extra effect, which is a wage effect. And that's as simple as saying what share of income comes from your wage income in a particular industry, and how did wages change in that industry as a result of a price change, and that price change is going to be shifted around by these tariffs. Okay, so now we can think about kind of wages and incorporate them into the analysis. He's also going to incorporate price changes of non-traded goods through general equilibrium effects that are obviously kind of bread and butter of our trade models. And so now we're going to allow, if a tariff changes in one good, all other goods may change their relative price, and how much their relative prices change is going to be captured here by this derivative, and how much I'm spending on this other good, say how much I'm spending on restaurants, multiplied by how much the price of restaurants changes because of the price of these traded goods. Okay, so kind of what's nice here is this is still all data, at least everything inside this bracket. This is the production share from your household enterprise across different industries. This is kind of wage changes with price changes. Now, do I have causal impacts of that? Maybe, maybe not, but this is something we could potentially estimate. This we can read straight off the data, which is the share of your wage coming from each different source. This is our consumption share as before, and this is the share of expenditure on different goods, not the good itself whose price is changing, so not rice in the Deaton example, but all the other goods. And then this is something we're going to have to estimate as well, how do prices change in those other goods. The tariff revenue is going nowhere. If you want to put the tariff revenue somewhere, maybe you could rebate it to the households in their M, and then you'd want that M to be changing. So we're going to be abstracting from that tariff revenue. My guess is to the first order, sorry, not to the first order, sorry, expression. As a kind of first approximation, the average household's probably not seeing so much of that revenue, but I guess you'd want to stick in government services here that they receive and change it. Or changes in tax rates. Okay, so the goal now is to fill in all of these objects, and Deaton, we had life easy because we could just read these shares off the data, but then of course we didn't really know how much prices would change with the change in the export tax. That seems important in order to quantify these things, and he kind of punted on that. So here we're going to try and fill in all of those derivatives as well. So on the consumption side, we can pull these shares spent on different goods. And this starts to kind of give you a sense of the richness here. Most countries in the world produce pretty rich consumption surveys where they go and ask households what they're spending on different products. And so, as long as you can think you can try and estimate how trade affects the prices of those different products, it's going to be pretty easy to pull these shares. And so all we're going to do here is calculate those shares, and he's going to assume perfect pass-through. So he's going to assume that tariff drop of 3.4% in clothing means clothing prices fell 3.4%. And then we're going to just pull off the share of clothing in your total expenditure. There's no savings or borrowing here, and there wasn't in Deaton either. And what does that tell us? Well, that tells us, again, plotted against log per capita expenditure. If we look at how big the impacts are, then we see that the richer people are going to gain and the poorer people are going to lose. So what in the household survey data is driving that? Why would the poor people lose and the rich people gain based on the tariff changes I showed you? because poor people disproportionately spend on food, that's Engel's law. And so we'd expect to see that if the food prices went up and all the other prices went down, the poor are going to be relatively harmed. So that comes out reasonably strongly here. And what's nice, that's just relying on the consumption side of the model, which we think we can get a pretty good handle on. Okay, now turning to I should say, oops. There's so these are just on traded goods. Now we turn to the effects on other prices and the effects on wages. The other prices he deals with in a pretty crude way. He's essentially going to, so we're now going to calculate the producer side effect, and then we'll put them together. Right, so now, yes, I'm just showing you this bit here. And now we need to look at the other bits. He's going to punt on the household firms. It's kind of the opposite to Deaton. I'm really interested in wage effects. I care about these people working in traded industries. Very few of them own factories and things like that. So I'm just going to ignore those guys. Obviously, if you care about farmers, we think everyone owns a business. What we'll do later has kind of both of these channels are going to be quite important. So we'll have them both in. Now we're going to look at the wage bit. And the wage bit is how much am I earning from different industries and how much of those wages are responding. Right, these ones here. Okay. Yeah, so you're right, you're saying, essentially there's G effects which change relative wages in other products as well. So what we're going to need for that is we're going to need to know how all prices in the economy change with the change in these prices from tariffs. So we know the shares spent on all these other different products. That's going to be in our consumption survey. This object here, what he's going to do is he's essentially just going to project the price of other goods. We had only 4 manufacturing goods, so very aggregated, crude categories. We're also going to have, I think, 3 non-traded goods. There's going to be, I'm forgetting, services. Yeah, maybe household services, one of them. Another one is things like restaurants and things like that. I forget what the third is. And we're going to see how those prices respond to prices in manufactured sectors by essentially just regressing the price of some non-traded service on the 3 traded prices and getting estimates from that. How well is that identified? I think the answer is pretty badly. And I would be pretty wary about such an approach. But if you did have a kind of plausibly exogenous variation and had a nice panel and you thought that these tariffs were truly exogenous and you put time into convincing us that, you could potentially use that variation in these exogenous tariff changes to see how these other relative prices change, with the caveat that we're always struggling with the level effect of these trade reforms. Which is going to be no different here, but he's just going to kind of push ahead and do that. Okay, so what about the wage effects? So we've got the tradables, we've got the non-tradables, which we're going to pull out in the way to describe. The wage effects, we're going to rely on these kind of Stolper-Samuelson-like relationships. Generically, you can write kind of the vector of prices as being related to the kind of vector of wages across different industries, depending on factor demands. And so what he's going to do is just kind of write down a functional form for that mapping, whereby wages are going to depend on skill levels. So there'll be kind of a common wage for different skill levels, and relative prices of these different goods will affect those relative wages, depending on whether they're skill intensive or skill unintensive. The kind of goods whose prices are changing. And again, we assume perfect pass-through, and to do this, previously we used a consumption survey. Here we're going to be using biannual household surveys, which are going to have information on kind of wages and prices, and then you can use that to essentially regress those wages on the price changes of these different sectors. So each of these is a regression. If you take food and beverages and you project it on if you take the wage of these different groups and you project them on the prices of these different products, then we're going to have the wage of primary education workers projected on food and beverages, clothing, house equipment, and other goods prices. The wage of secondary education workers projected on those same things, and college education workers. And what we might expect comes out of here, which is if food and beverage prices go up, then the wage of primary education workers rises. Meanwhile, if house equipment, which is more skilled, I mean, these are such aggregated categories, it's hard to know quite what to make of them, but it certainly sounds more skilled than food and beverages, then primary education wages fall. And similarly, if we look at college education, food and beverages and clothing, if their prices rise, then the relative wage of college educated workers falls, and they benefit when house equipment or other goods goes up in prices. So we're getting these kind of Stolper-Samuelson-like effects here. But again, this is a bit of a crazy regression here. We're regressing kind of wage changes over 16 periods on these 4 prices and kind of crossing your fingers and hoping that these are giving us sensible things. Now, this was 2005. We have much better data now. We have much higher standards for identification. And so this is obviously kind of ripe for redoing, but you get the idea. Okay, so when we calculate that, what we see now is this is just on the labor income effects. It's now the poor who are kind of hurt most from this trade liberalization. Why? Well, the price of food is going up. Sorry, the poor gain the most. Why? Because the price of food's going up. That's increasing the demands for unskilled labor. That's raising their wages. Meanwhile, the price of these other things, clothing, house equipment, other goods, is going down. And that's lowering the relative demand for skilled labor, the wealthier people. Okay, so we have these 2 countervailing forces. The poor are hurt most by the food prices rising, but they gain most on the labor side from the food prices rising, because these are unskilled sectors. So when you put it all together, it's that labor effect that really dominates. And so the rich gain more than the poor from this trade liberalization episode based on these estimates. So kind of an obvious question here is this remotely sensible? Obviously, we've made a lot of assumptions, and also we haven't thought particularly hard about endogeneity, but does this kind of resonate with the poor kind of being big winners and the rich losing? Yeah.
It's interesting because presumably the price effect is more salient. Like people will look at their food prices and see them going up, and they won't realize that their wages go up.
Yeah, so it's possible that yeah, what I'll show you later is maybe the flip side, which is the job losses are very salient, we think. When we think about trade with China, it's the job losses everyone hears about, while people don't, my prices did fall 6%, and thanks to trade with China, that was pretty good. So normally we think the other way, but.
The story that the poor gain is out of sync with the story we're being told yesterday about how in most instances globalization or increase in
Yeah, so there's a very different result to what we find elsewhere and using other methods. One potential explanation is this is Mercosur. And so if you look, it's not quite a full-on trade liberalization. It's more, for Argentina, it's more liberalization with your neighbors, and in some cases, less liberalization with the world. So, and obviously the food price rise is coming from that. And so that's one nuance. But I think the big one is, I mean, if you speak to any South American, they're not going to tell you that, food price rises, the poor go out in the streets and celebrate, and the rich are, very, very upset here. This is pretty crazy, some of the empirics that are going into these estimates, particularly, you're projecting, wages on 4 prices or something like that in these very coarse groups. And then on you're assuming perfect pass-through. What else are we assuming here? That the rich and the poor are consuming the same types of food. And if the rich are buying all of these foreign foods and the poor only ever ate domestic food anyway, because that was the cheapest kind of varieties, then these consumption effects might be quite different. And if the types of food that compete with these kind of foreign varieties is very different to the types of food and is more skilled, the production of it, you might get very different impacts there too. Okay, so I certainly wouldn't take this and go to the Argentinian government and tell them, go and help the poor, right? Raise those food prices. I think you should do some more work before doing that. But the way I think about this paper is this is really a kind of framework which is incredibly powerful given the data we have today, right? Which is now you can get access to incredibly rich databases showing people's myriad of interactions with international markets, and just by using these kind of small changes or first order type approaches, you can get a lot of richness and estimates which we think are a very good starting point, and then maybe you want to add some more complications on top of those. But in terms of passing a smell test, seeing how much different types of individuals are consuming of different types of exports and different types of imports, or how much they're producing in sectors of export and how much they're consuming in sectors of import, etc., seems like it will get us quite far.
But you're saying that the analysis is not.
I'm going to show you some more modern papers, not on Mercosur with Argentina there.
Why hasn't
Well, a couple of reasons. I think in general, part of the reason I chose this topic to teach is I think typically we fall into one of these two categories of either wanting to do pure reduced form work or wanting to do these big models with fully specified production sides, etc. And so this isn't an area that's seen an enormous amount of work. Now, that's been changing, I think, in the last couple of years because of this amazing data we have, which just, maybe you'll do more later in the paper, but as a first, smell test, let's see these these types of objects. So I think this is ripe for redoing. As you also are presumably aware, the incentive for a student to redo something rather than at least change the context and the setting is quite low. And so presumably that's another reason. The other thing is you need instruments, or you need some credible identification strategy. And maybe Argentina, having worked on Argentina recently, is not the best data country for various reasons. So maybe you're better off going to Brazil, where we have lots of rich data, and asking about their trade reforms, which would be maybe an easier task. Okay, so what are the shortcomings here? Well, there's a fair amount of them. The aggregation level was very, very coarse. Crazily coarse, I think. These broad industry categories, which didn't, at least to me, scream high skill, low skill, household equipment or whatever, household furniture, etc. We didn't know about kind of the origin of products in the consumption basket or on the production side, and these might be very different, different for high skill workers versus low skill workers, different for rich and poor consumers. The example of rich consumers buying a lot of imported Italian foods and the local consumers buying the local substitutes, for example. We didn't love those price change causal effects, which were essentially just associations, or the fact that we assumed a pass-through of tariff changes to price changes of 1-for-1, when at least any kind of well-specified equation I've seen for that suggests, maybe 0 is a better base starting point than 1. Very low kind of pass-through rates typically to consumer prices, at least to border prices, is different. The other thing is, on the income side, when we're thinking about something like the China shock, then we need to think about unemployment. And to think about unemployment, we need to think about leisure in order to do that correctly. We haven't thought at all about capitalists here who have some fixed factor or the presence of some fixed factor, or potentially people are exposed through IO linkages, and so they themselves aren't potentially experiencing this price change, but their inputs, for example, change in price. Maybe they're imported directly, or maybe they sell to firms who are exporting or compete with imports. Okay, so I'll briefly talk about two papers that kind of think about relaxing some of those constraints by kind of exploiting some of this rich data. And these are obviously more up-to-date examples. And so you'll see kind of where this literature can go in terms of richness. So the first is Kim and Vogel. They're going to ignore the consumption side entirely and just think about first order effects on the production side, in particular for wages. And what they're going to do is they're going to think through that wage expression, but having a labor leisure decision and potentially having kind of arbitrary heterogeneity amongst workers. And what this is going to give us is we're still going to get that expression like in Porto for wage changes, which is the share of my income coming from working in a particular job. And you can think of this as a household or representative household for some group you're interested in, like poor people in the north of the country or something like that. But rather than us just having this, how much does the wage change and how much is my income coming from that wage source, now we're also going to have potentially an unemployment margin. And the kind of 2 points they make, the first is, what is the wage change we care about? Well, it's this counterfactual wage change if I stay doing exactly the same thing I was doing before, okay? This is a small change, and so we're ignoring substitution because to the first order, that has no welfare impacts. And so the wage we really want to know is, if I was doing the exact same job, the same hours, how much does that wage change? So they're going to use kind of rich US data and look at the China shock, and they're going to be very careful to be kind of controlling for the same individual who stays in that same job and only estimate wage changes of them, rather than mix in people who may have moved jobs or who may have adjusted hours. I guess that's the first point. That wage change should be conditional on the same job. The second is on the unemployment side. So the first insight here is moving in and out of the labor force is not welfare relevant to the first order if it's a voluntary choice. Okay, they've decided to substitute between work and leisure under a kind of first order approximation by the envelope condition, then that's not welfare relevant. What is welfare relevant is me becoming unemployed involuntarily. I would have liked to continue working, I'm laid off, I lose my job. So there, what we care about is kind of the lost income and potentially any non-pecuniary benefits as well. Now you can see why this is going to be difficult. It's going to be difficult because it's really hard to know if someone was voluntarily or involuntarily unemployed, particularly since often whether you can get benefits depends on one versus the other. And so you're incentivized to misreport, and the companies often help you to do that. But if you can solve that problem, this is the right way to kind of think about it. Okay, so we care about involuntary unemployment to the first order, people deciding they're going to retire a little bit earlier. We don't care about the first order. So they can go and apply this to the PNTR with China. They're going to get kind of reasonably large effects comparing percentiles, again, using the kind of Ortodorn and Hansen style instrument. In numbers, in the 90th percentile, the welfare of the commuting zones lower by 3.1 percentage points relative to the 10th percentile. And as you can see why, we've made progress here, but we've also had to do some crazy things, which is 2/3 of that effect is coming from the non-pecuniary impacts of unemployment. We know big unemployment rises thanks to the China shock or due to the China shock. And that's really driving a lot of this welfare effect. How do we know what the non-pecuniary benefit or cost of losing a job is and sitting around at home? But we don't know so much. And so we're going to use some questions from the life satisfaction literature, which is going to give essentially twice the non-pecuniary cost versus the pecuniary ones when they're asking questions about trade-offs between those two. Do you have a question? Oh, sorry, my bad. It's not an ADH shock. Permanent normal trading relationships with China. So Pearson Schott in various papers have used this as an alternative to using the Otto-Dorn and Hansen variation to think about the China shock. And it exploits the fact that somewhat unexpectedly, the US authorized permanent normal trade relationship with China. Otherwise, every year they would have to vote whether or not to kind of apply the WTO tariffs or to apply the Hoots-Smalley tariffs, which are kind of prohibitively high. And every year they voted, but there was some uncertainty every year on whether these Chinese firms would face huge tariffs because they were a non-market economy. And so it means that they value every job loss. They know the income loss from that. And they're going to assume that the non-pecuniary cost is twice the income loss. And that's coming from some life satisfaction literature that asks hypothetical questions. And one way of interpreting these hypotheticals is it's twice as bad as the income loss for me to have lost my job. There's a little experimental work on this now for people who are interested. It's in a very specific setting of refugee camps, but there it does seem that people are essentially willing to pay for a job. You give them kind of small jobs, and then Reshma Hassan on this paper, I'm forgetting the other co-author, and then you take away that job, and they're willing to essentially take a negative salary in order to keep on doing it. Yep. That's also not welfare relevant to the first order if you're choosing to change it. Now, again, maybe I was forced to drop my hours, and then you're going to need to know that, which is hard enough to know if it's involved in employment, but then I don't know. I guess you would know better if any data set says I changed hours against my will. Okay, so this is very nice recent work showing how to go much further on the income side. Another very nice recent paper. This isn't going to be a paper about first order effects, although they will show those first order effects. They're going to go beyond and have a kind of richer model. But this nicely illustrates the kind of richness of new data in order to really elaborate on the kind of Porter approach. So they're going to use Ecuadorian data. And what's going to be very nice here is they're going to know export and import exposure because they're going to know customs. They're going to know each firm, what they're importing and what they're exporting. They're going to have the firm-to-firm network from tax records. So that's going to mean I know that my buyer who bought my product subsequently exported stuff. You don't know exactly if they exported the thing with my input in, but you know that they exported stuff. You also know that if I make something, if imports come into my firm, then those are going to be intermediates and how they propagate through the network. On the employee side, they have social security data that's been merged in here and firm owners. So we're going to know something about income from firm ownership as well as from wages in different sectors. And you can merge all of these things together to really tease out these two different channels. So if I'm looking at exposure to exports, primarily that's going to be if the types of things I produce are purchased by foreigners. If I look at exposure and imports, so that's coming from two channels. The first is if I work in a sector where there's a lot of imports, that's going to hurt me. The second is if I work in a sector that uses a lot of foreign inputs, then cheaper imports are going to benefit me. Again, those things could differ a lot across the income distribution. And so what they're going to find is this is export exposure. is they're going to find it's actually people in the middle of the income distribution who benefit most. The factors they own are most exposed to exports. And that's coming from the fact that these types of manufacturers, which are exported and tend to employ people who are kind of in the middle of the income distribution. Think of the kind of well-paid blue-collar worker. Import exposure seems to be very pro-rich. The rich are much less exposed to imports. Exposure to imports is bad if you're having a trade liberalization. Why are they much less exposed to imports? Well, it's coming from the fact they actually, many of them like imports because they work in high-skill sectors. Those high-skill sectors use a lot of imported intermediates, and so reductions in the price of imports actually benefit them. In net, it's still slightly positive, so but they're close to indifferent. Well, poor people don't like imports. They work in sectors which compete a lot with those imports. So it's just on the production side, but this shows how these kind of very rich data allow us to go much further. Okay, so hopefully that gives you kind of a sense of where we can go on the production side. We can go kind of much deeper here. And as I said, my motivation for talking about this today was I think there's kind of huge opportunities here to kind of give us very, very believable estimates of impacts of various policies by exploiting this richness. Okay, so let's change back to the consumption side and talk a little bit about a channel which was ignored kind of inherently in the first order approach, which is variety. Okay, so I'll talk a bit about one of my papers and then briefly about some new work by Treb Allen at the end. And we ended at 11, right? Okay, so I'll go into a bit more detail here. Okay, so what we're going to be looking at in this paper is a particular, I guess, liberalization effect event, which isn't going to be trade per se or direct trade, but foreign direct investment. But these kind of approaches could be applied equally well to kind of a trade episode, with the caveat that the identification, how credible that is going to depend a lot on exactly the kind of shock you're exploring. A kind of a foreign firm enters the market. We're going to be focusing on foreign supermarket entry into Mexico. Foreign supermarkets obviously have a lot to do with many consumption categories we're familiar with, since a lot of your consumption is funneled through retailers. But we might also expect not just consumption effects, but also effects on the production side. And coming back to that question earlier, when people first think about these types of impacts, think about Walmart coming to town, the first thing they think about is the production side effects, particularly what's going to happen to workers at traditional mom and pop stores, what's going to happen to these mom and pop stores. And there's also variety effects baked in there. Oh, Main Street's not going to look the same. We're going to lose out on all those stores we like to go to. So we're going to be trying to tease those out. Kind of as a kind of side note, I think there's far too little work on retail in general. It's a very big employer, maybe 15 to 20% of employment in developing countries. I think similar in developed countries, maybe 10 to 15% of GDP. It's not the most productive industry, but it's a large employer. And about half of household expenditures go through the kind of retail sector. Obviously, the others are things such as cars and housing and things like that. Not only is this a big sector, but there's also been very heated policy debates. Many countries have been reluctant to invite foreign retailers into their countries for fear these mom and pop stores in particular will be affected. So we'll be focusing on a particular setting, which is Mexico during the main wave of their foreign retail expansion. And during this period, the number of foreign-owned supermarkets increased from 365 to about 1,300. So here's a map before this big expansion. Walmart is the main foreign supermarket in Mexico. They'd started to open in a few places. Safeway had a few supermarkets in the north of Mexico, but only kind of the biggest cities were served, plus the north of Mexico. Sorry, served by foreign supermarkets. By the end of our sample period, basically every major town and city in Mexico had a Walmart or one of their other chains. Okay, so let me start with some motivating evidence. So how do these supermarkets differ once they arrive? So what we can do is we can just project the price that they're charging for a particular barcode in a particular municipality on a dummy for whether it's a foreign store. And we can do this because the Mexican government produces very detailed price data in order to calculate the CPI, and that's going to allow us to see how prices differ within the same location for the same barcode. Think about a 330 milliliter can of Diet Coke. So what we see is that the foreign stores are charging 12% less for identical barcodes. Okay, so these stores are much cheaper. That's the first thing. Okay. The second thing is they're selling different products. If you just regress prices on a foreign store dummy and don't control for the barcode, prices are 25% higher. Why is that? They're selling bigger pack sizes. They're selling fancier things. These are foreign stores rather than domestic stores. Okay, they also sell more variety. If we look at the number of barcodes in these stores now, just compared to modern retailers, domestic retailers, we see many more varieties. They have bigger stores as well. They have more floor space. So clearly, these aren't the same stores. They're charging lower prices. They're also, something I can't capture here, tend to be located on the edge of town and have big car parks. So they're also attracting a different clientele. That clientele is likely to be richer, can benefit from buying large bundles since they have their car with them. Okay, so that's just by way of background. So we're expecting we may see kind of some big consumer effects from these lower prices, potentially variety effects. How can we go and capture these? So we're going to kind of decompose the compensating variation, which is just the expenditure required under these kind of new prices brought about by these new stores to obtain the same utility as before, given my kind of nominal income today. We can decompose it into a cost of living effect, which is the pure effect of those price changes, holding fixed utility at its initial level, and a kind of nominal income effect. How much is the amount of money in my pocket change? So in principle, this thing we can read off the data. If I have data on nominal incomes, I have some variation that I think is plausibly exogenous. I can tell you how much my nominal incomes change as a result of this liberalization or this foreign store entry. What I can't do is tell you how much the cost of living changed, since these are a bunch of new stores and many of these products just simply weren't available before. And so I can't just read off price changes for those products. Okay, so what are we going to do? So we're going to follow kind of a classic idea from Feenstra, and that obviously predates Feenstra by a long way, by a long time, which is I can think of what this foreign store does is essentially providing a new product. Previously, consumers had a choice of 3 supermarkets and 75 mom and pop stores in their town. Now in comes Walmart. Essentially, it's a new variety. Okay, and I can choose whether or not I go and shop there. And obviously, retail is a bit different to normal products, which may enter directly, consumption of individual goods enters directly into the utility function. But at least we can write down a set of demands where, essentially what we'll be trying to work out is how readily consumers substitute between different varieties of supermarket, and we're going to be able to work out kind of the welfare benefits of that new product, which is a kind of new option to shop at from kind of classic ways that we value new products. Okay, and this goes back to kind of Hicks, whose idea was, well, a new product, we don't know the price change since it wasn't previously observed. If we can work out the price at which demand would have been zero for that product, then we could essentially use our standard tools estimating the welfare impacts of price changes, just assuming that initially the price was equal to whatever was required to ensure zero consumption. And so, when the iPhone arrived, if someone was willing to spend $1.3 million for an iPhone, but no one was willing to spend more than that, we could think of the iPhone as costing $1.31 million. Initially, we would have got demand of zero, and we can use our standard tools. Okay, so that's going to be basically our approach. And then to implement that, we're going to have a kind of nested CS utility function, where this is going to make it very easy to estimate the gains from new products, since Feenstra has shown us how to do that in the CS framework. And for people familiar with the trade literature more broadly, Broder and Weinstein kind of popularized this in their estimates of the gains from variety.
But we're assuming that consumers are getting utility from Walmart percent. Walmart is the
So very specifically, they're going to get utility from consuming over different product groups like meat or drinks. That's going to be Cobb Douglas, although it could be CS. Then over stores, they're going to have a CS utility function where they substitute between stores. And why do they like stores? Well, they're getting some quantity aggregate when they go to those stores. And what is that quantity aggregate? That quantity aggregate is essentially what they would go and purchase if they went into that store and they went through the aisles and got everything they wanted. So this is kind of multi-stage budgeting, or think about two-stage budgeting or something like that. So first I pick, how much I spend in each store, and then conditional, or first I pick what I would do if I went into each store, and then I pick how much to spend on each store based on those price indices.
So the reason why Walmart is a new variety is because it has a different range of goods.
Potentially. So this allows there to be either a different range of goods, which we would struggle to deal with directly, or because it's an amenity in itself, because it has a big car park, for example. And so if you have a car, this is really good for you. And so here we're going to have this beta, which determines the kind of value the consumer places on each variety, some taste shifter. And what we're going to uncover, if a lot of people go to Walmart, that's some combination of them having these products they like that they couldn't get before, and maybe they're also having a taste shifter for it. Speaking to a lot of Eastern Europeans, when these foreign supermarkets came in the 1990s, they definitely speak of having a positive amenity shock. They just used to go in as an activity to, I guess, enjoy this capitalist temple. And I think there's kind of some element of that with Walmart in Mexico as well, maybe less so than in Eastern Europe. But this was, the arrival of this kind of new way of shopping to some degree. Wide aisles, tons of variety. Just to be clear, they had domestic supermarkets at this point in time. They just weren't very efficient. They didn't have very good prices, and they didn't have a lot of variety.
The domestic supermarkets
Potentially, and I'll show you that. Okay, so we can write down a full welfare expression, basically the same idea as in Deaton. Let me start with this one, I guess. Just looking on the consumption side for now, assuming we ignored these new varieties, Then we could do a standard first order approach. This is more like what Eric was suggesting, which would be, let me start once Walmart's already there, because now I kind of know what they're selling and all those things. And then let's ask what would have happened if I went and eradicated Walmart. And what am I going to do? I'm going to take each barcode. And if I assume that a barcode purchased from Walmart is its own product to a barcode purchased from another store, which seems reasonable. I have to travel to those stores, and they're not perfect substitutes for each other. Then what I can do is I can take the budget share spent on each of those barcodes, where this could be a Coke can from Walmart, a Coke can from a domestic store. And then I can assume the disappearance of Walmart is equivalent to me lowering the price, raising the price of that good to what the price would have been in the domestic store if I had gone and purchased that good in the domestic store. Meanwhile, if I'm purchasing goods even once Walmart's in town from a domestic store, I just look at the price change in the domestic store pre-post Walmart's entry. So this is price pre-post Walmart entry in a domestic store. This is price pre-post entry in domestic store plus the price difference between Walmart and the domestic store once they're there. Okay, and then I can go and just sum this, and I have all the different products, and I can see what would happen if I take it away. So I can think of this as, we're not really doing anything here about variety because we're not capturing that substitution because of this first order approach, but we are capturing some of these effects. To do this, I just need causal estimates of these price changes plus these budget shares, which I can read off a rich consumption survey. Now, if I want to incorporate fully the gains from variety, I have to depart from this kind of first order. We have to go into that demand structure I just wrote down. And we're going to get this kind of nice expression, which was kind of first shown by Feenstra. And this is kind of a feature of the CS, which is very powerful. So under CS, what is essentially the welfare change from price changes? So what's the kind of price index change? Depends on two components. This thing here is a standard Sato-Varsha price index. That is the correct price index for CS. What's nice about the Sato-Varsha version of it is this is the price in a continuing store for kind of this itself is a kind of price aggregate of price index for, say, a modern domestic supermarket. This is the price in period 1, this is the price in period 0. And then what are the weights for those prices, these omegas? Well, what the nice thing about the Sato-Varsha formulation is those omegas are just functions of budget shares. And so it's kind of share differences over log share differences. And so this means at no point do I need an elasticity of substitution to calculate a Sato-Varsha price index. Everything's in the budget shares. We can read those off the data. So this is a totally standard thing. This just says, if the prices of some continuing variety, there's no new varieties. If those things go up relative to period 0, when this store enters, then that's going to kind of raise my cost of living. That's going to lower my welfare. This is the Feenstra bit, and Feenstra says, listen, here let's just look at these continuing varieties. Think about in our case modern stores, or if you're doing whatever honey cinnamon Cheerios, it's kind of other cereal brands. Then this term here is the new variety term. What is it? It's the share I'm spending on continuing varieties in period 1. That's this thing here. Over the share I'm spending on continuing varieties in period 0, all to kind of a function of the elasticity of substitution across varieties. Again, so the intuition is very simple, which is, how big a deal is it if Walmart comes to town and say they manage to grab 15% market share? Well, the fact they've grabbed 15% market share says people probably like this product quite a lot. Okay, so this number here is the market share of the continuing varieties. Well, that's going to be 85% if the new variety grabs 15% of the market. We may also kind of lose domestic varieties. And if we lose domestic varieties, the mom and pop stores close, and half my spending was at these mom and pop stores, that really hurts me. This is the whole, I like shopping at Main Street, and now those stores close, that's really bad. That's the denominator here. Okay, if all the stores survive, then the share of these continuing stores in period 0 is 100%. So, the share is obviously useful. Walmart's doing well. If it's grabbed 15% of market share, people seem to like it. How much they like it's going to be determined by this elasticity of substitution. If people substitute very, very inelastically, 15% is a huge deal for welfare. If people substitute very elastically, 15%, it could have just been epsilon better and it would have grabbed 15% market share. So this isn't a big welfare gain. Okay, and what's very nice about this formula is we do need something else, which is elasticity of substitution, but these shares are observable, and compared to other utility functions, more complicated utility functions, everything's determined just by one elasticity of substitution and one market share. And so, we're going to have to, in order to estimate these virtual prices at some level, you're going to have to be estimating demand curves. But this is pretty much as easy as it gets and as simple as it gets. And we don't kind of lose track of what the moments are that are kind of giving us our result. You could quibble, I don't love CES, I'm not sure how much I believe these results, but I can tell you this and I can tell you this, and you'll still get something out of those two numbers. They're obviously strongly related to how big the welfare of X will be. Okay, you can add crowding out or something like that, and then these things will become more complicated. Okay, any questions? Okay, so what do we need to estimate these? We're going to need to know causal effects. These are in blue on competitors' prices. For this kind of variety term, these are market shares for these foreign producers. So we'll need causal impacts essentially on market shares. How much does the entry lead to, say, the closure of domestic stores? And then we'll need an elasticity of substitution, which we'll have to estimate. And that we'll be doing with the kind of Nielsen-like consumption data. If we just want that pure first order approach without the variety, then we don't need a demand parameter because the Sato-Varsha weights don't involve, we don't need a demand parameter because everything's first order. We just need budget shares, causal price changes. Okay, so on the production side, we can do very similar to what I've shown you before. We'll just take how much income you're getting from various different sectors, from labor supply to the retail sector, from owning a mom and pop store potentially, from potentially working outside the retail sector, from potentially owning businesses outside the retail sector. So this is reasonably exhaustive. We don't have government payments and such like, but this is going to capture here, a mom and pop store. I work in a mom and pop store. We can break these all out by traditional and modern. I'm probably going to be hurt by the arrival of Walmart. If I own a mom and pop store, I'm definitely going to be hurt by the arrival of Walmart. If I'm in other sectors, maybe I'm hurt, maybe I'm not. Do I supply Walmart? Then I might benefit. Do I supply mom and pop stores? I might lose out. Okay, so how are we actually going to fill in these moments? So we're going to pay attention to those causal moments. And here's where the richer data you have, the more carefully you think about the setting, you can make each of these different components more or less convincing. Our approach here is going to be to use event studies. And in particular, these are consumer retail prices at domestic stores, not the foreign store. So this is kind of the moment we need if we want to know, how much did prices change in continuing varieties for our Sato-Varsha index. We also need to know this for those first order approximations to know how much the price change was coming on things you were buying from other stores already versus how much is coming from price changes at products you were purchasing at the foreign store. So what you see is there's kind of no pre-trend. When the foreign store enters the municipality level, I will be thinking of an entry event, Walmart arriving in your particular municipality, and I'll be doing welfare impacts on your municipality. And notice I haven't had to say anything about the production side. That's, without loss of generality, if I care about welfare, I don't need to know about the production side. If I can go and measure your nominal incomes, and I can go and measure all the prices you face, right? Utility is going to be purely a function of your income and your prices. And so why would we need to model the production side? Say I wanted to try and break some of these effects into, what's coming from profits vis-a-vis what's coming, reduce markups vis-a-vis productivity changes. Obviously, then I'll need the production side. Why is that irrelevant on the consumption side? Well, if it is markups, that's going to show up in the profits going to people in your municipality, potentially, maybe the owner of the company who now has bigger take-home pay, vis-a-vis productivity effects. They may show up slightly differently, etc. So we're going to be able to read those off the data with the caveat that, obviously you need richer data to, well, as rich data as possible to be able to see profit effects. In our setting, a lot of the benefits of Walmart in terms of profits are leaving the municipality. It's a company headquartered in Mexico City, whose majority owner is based in Bentonville, Arkansas. And so if we care about the welfare of a particular location, some of these profit issues aren't so big. In other settings where we do care, then we need to go back to that paper Dow et al., which knows the firm registry, who owns which companies, and then you can go and track them that way. Okay, so what do we see when Walmart arrives? For the same barcode in the same store, we see prices begin to fall essentially as soon as the foreign store opens, before leveling off at about 3% lower prices. Okay, and this is kind of differential. These price drops can differ between mom and pop stores and traditional retailers. I think the price drops are bigger for the supermarkets who are closer competitors. So this is kind of one kind of moment here. What happens when the foreign store comes? The domestic stores lower their prices for the same goods. Is this unique to foreign stores entering? Could the same thing happen if a big domestic chain opens a store? Well, the answer is no. When big domestic stores come, the domestic stores don't lower their prices, the other domestic stores. This is also consistent with Walmart being kicked out of the Mexican Retailer Association for the heinous crime of writing their competitors' prices on their flyers, which was not considered the done thing amongst the Mexican Retailer Association, but you could see how that would induce price competition. Okay, so that's kind of one moment we'll need. Another moment, which is going to be critical, is the kind of consumption share spent on these foreign varieties once they've entered. And these are kind of enormous. So this data is coming from a Nielsen-like home scanner survey, which kind of records everything you buy and from which stores you buy them from. And at least of the types of goods captured in that survey, which are essentially household retail expenditure, the richest households are spending 40–50% of their household retail expenditure at these foreign supermarkets. Okay, so this is enormous and kind of shocked us. Essentially, Walmart was aiming for a slightly higher quality market in Mexico and succeeded beyond their wildest expectations. Their market shares are higher in Mexico than they are in the US, to give you a sense. Poor people benefit much less. Their market shares about 10–11% at Walmart. Why is that? Well, you kind of need a car to go there. And if you don't have a car, it's not much use. There were a few kind of urban stores, and now they have some smaller format stores as well. The other thing is they're not selling the cheapest products. The products they're selling are cheap for those barcodes, but they're aiming for the middle class here. So it's not the cheapest way to buy food. It's just cheapest way to buy a particular type of. When a domestic store comes in, they don't capture nearly anything like the market share, despite similar floor size. Okay, so people love these stores. So this is already going to tell you an enormous amount. It's going to tell you, unless those elasticity of substitution are incredibly high, these are going to be big welfare gains for these consumers if they're spending so much of their retail consumption on this sector. The second thing it's going to say is the rich are going to benefit much more than the poor. They're the ones spending a lot in these stores. Okay, in the paper, we need obviously all those other moments on what happens to wages, what happens maybe broken down by different sectors, what's that elasticity of substitution, what's happening to employment, are people losing their jobs, what's happening to business owners, what's happening to their profits, are stores closing. Stores closing also matter for consumers because they're losing these varieties. And so we can estimate all of these again through these event studies, some noisier than others, depending on where the data comes from. This is total nominal incomes from employment surveys, total employment from those employment surveys. On the aggregate level, not much is happening. But when we dive in, we see that traditional retail workers do lose out. They lose out quite a lot. Their employment falls by about 11%. Their incomes fall by about 6% conditional employment. So, sorry, they fall by 6%. Why not the full amount? Well, some of them go and get jobs after. So, it's certainly the case that all of these fears about, these foreign supermarkets coming to town, it does hurt traditional retail workers. It also hurts those mom and pop store owners. Their profits go down by about 5% and about 10% of them exit. If you work in modern retail, you benefit. Walmart pays relatively high wages for modern retail workers. That sector is expanding. The other sectors aren't affected very much. So agriculture, manufacturing, they're not supplying these local supermarkets or these foreign supermarkets very much. Okay, so at the end of the paper, we can pull this all together. We have those consumer effects, including variety or not including variety, depending if we do the first order or the variety adjusted one. Those producer effects. And how do we kind of pull these all together? Well, what's very nice is in many countries, as I mentioned, you have household surveys. Those household surveys have consumption modules, they have employment modules. And so for every individual in a round of the household survey in Mexico, we know what their household's doing and what they're consuming. They even say in Mexico, whether they're consuming, say, meat, they say break it down by whether they're buying from mom and pop stores versus modern supermarkets. And so what we can do is for every individual in our survey, we can calculate what are the gains from the arrival of this foreign retailer. And this gives us incredibly rich heterogeneity because I know a match here between where I'm working and what I'm consuming. And so, if it's a case that people who work at modern retail, people who work in traditional retail, buy all the stuff that they'll really benefit from Walmart, then their losses are lower, obviously. And so we allow that rich heterogeneity. Everyone can buy different things. And then I can just plot, in this case, by percentiles of the income distribution, but we could do it by region or by household demographics, how the gains differ. And as we suggested, the aggregate gains, which is this dark blue line, they're large. They're between 5 and 6%. And they're kind of pro-rich. The rich gain even more than the poor. We can break that into the kind of different components. On the income side, they tend to lose out, but very few people are employed in retail. And so because very few people are employed in retail and some of these guys gain if you're in modern retail, those effects are really swamped by the consumption side effects. Everyone's going to Walmart, everyone's shopping there and enjoying it. Very few people are losing their jobs. And here we can see it's also not just the poor who suffer and the rich who benefit. On average, each income group is benefiting, although there are obviously individual losers, the mom and pop store owners. Okay, so there's additional forces at play here. Obviously, the rich spend more on food, spend less on food, but they're disproportionately likely to go to these foreign retailers. And so if they spent the same on food as poor households, things would be even more pro-rich. And the income effects are actually, quite uneven, quite mixed across the income distribution. Store owners are quite rich. Traditional store workers are quite poor. Both of those guys are losing out. modern retail workers are in the middle. Okay, so it's 11:02, so let me wrap up there. Let me just briefly say, there's a nice new paper by Treb Allen that you can look on their website. It's very preliminary, but they're doing this in an urban context where they know where everyone's spending money, where everyone is consuming within the city and where they're working within the city, from a lot of cell phone and payroll data and bank data. And this allows them to ask, you know, when tourism comes to Barcelona, who benefits, who loses? Well, you know, people who used to go to areas that get flooded with tourists and stop going, those guys are losing out on the consumption side. The amenity value of that area of town has gone way down, and the prices tend to have gone way up as well. And the amenity can be backed out essentially the same way we're doing it here. And then on the income side, some people benefit a lot because now I'm a waiter and I'm getting lots more money from serving these tourists. Other people less so. And you can go and do a similar calculation. They're also going to show you how to get slightly closer to the GE as well. Okay, so let me wrap up. First order approximations, I think, can take us really quite a long way with minimal assumptions. It's straightforward to combine with causal inference on price changes, wage changes, etc. And then you can add more structure where you think it's important for answering a particular question you have in mind. And you know, as I've hopefully shown you, the richness of the distribution analysis here goes beyond anything we can achieve using other measures we have, just because we can get these budget shares and production shares kind of at the household level, which allows us to really dive deep into the heterogeneity. So thank you very much, and I'm happy to answer any questions, and I'll also see you in half an hour.